One thing I found interesting is I think most of America knows you as this gun control advocate and activist that rose to prominence after Parkland, but um, you grew up in a household, you weren't unfamiliar with guns. Your dad was a veteran and an FBI agent, and you were not somebody that grew up being that where guns were alien, that they were something that you were taught about and you were familiar with. What were your thoughts about kind of guns, the Second Amendment, and the limitations to that before the incident at Parkland?
I mean, it's interesting. I had to argue before Parkland. I was in speech and debate, and I had to argue in those classes on things like universal background checks and in competitions where I had to have a case, both for universal background checks, for example, and against universal background checks. And I had to do that on multiple topics related to firearms. And it gave me a really, I would say, kind of nuanced perspective because few people have to most people just pick what they believe in and just only ever focus on arguing for that. But when you're in speech and debate, you have to argue equally strong on both sides. And because of that, I saw some of the arguments when I was younger about there's a lot of right wing people in my family, not necessarily my immediate family, but in my extended family. And I could see some of the arguments that they were making, but it was just so obvious to me after the shooting how this easily could have been prevented. The shooter at my high school, he couldn't purchase a handgun because he wasn't old enough yet. Because if you're under 21, you can't buy a handgun from a federally licensed dealer. But he could purchase an AR-15 because he was over 18 years old. That just didn't make sense to me. If you can't buy a handgun, why should you be able to buy an AR-15? Um, and the other thing that really struck me was the fact that we came to find out that the shooter at my high school repeatedly threatened to shoot at my high school multiple times and was reported to the FBI and local law enforcement multiple times, and all of them failed. And part of what happened was that there was no law in place that could have removed his firearm from him, like a red flag law. And that is part of what changed my perspective on it, along with realizing that there's more nuance here. We can't just focus on how somebody gets a gun, although I think that is the most impactful thing we can do to reduce gun deaths. We need to focus as well on why are they picking up the gun to murder people at the same time. Why, whether it's a school shooting that is driven by hatred, like the shooter at my high school was, a white supremacist and anti-Semite that literally drew swastikas on all kinds of things that he owned. And I believe he drew it on his gun too, on like the magazine as well. You know, whether it's addressing that kind of hatred or it's addressing the poverty that drives daily gun violence, that drives somebody to want to pick up a gun to go and kill somebody else, or it's addressing the despair that drives gun suicides. We can't just focus on how somebody gets a gun. We got to focus on both why do they pull the trigger and how do they get the firearm. A lot of experts talk about two things when it comes to how somebody ends up dying from gun violence. They talk about capability and they talk about intent. We need to talk about how do these shooters get the capability to be able to murder people, which is how do they get that firearm, and why do they have the intent to do that in the first place and not treat this as an either or. And that's part of what I try to emphasize in this work is that I'm willing to work across the aisle with people, even if they're not willing to talk about stronger gun laws necessarily. Let's figure out what we can agree on, whether it's funding more mental health programs for the 2/3 of gun deaths that are suicides, funding programs that get young people that are the most at risk of both being victims and perpetrators of gun violence. Because a lot of the time, young people that are committing daily acts of gun violence are teenagers that don't have jobs, that don't have opportunity, that don't have a pathway to college, that don't have great grades. How can we get the mentorship, resources, and the financial support so they don't feel the need to pick up a firearm? I'm willing to work across the aisle on those things because I don't see it as a compromise of my values. And even if it's only going to save one life, it is still worth it.
I wanted to ask you about what happened at Parkland and in this context. First off, it was Valentine's Day 2018. I don't want to get too much into it. It's been talked about a lot. If people haven't read about it or seen, go Google it. It was an absolute tragedy. You talked about earlier how you had some journalism background. You were a student journalist at that time. You started interviewing people in your classroom and then started doing these media hits and became just kind of everywhere. I remember just seeing you on all different kinds of news shows and talk shows, and you were kind of just everywhere. I guess you were 17 at the time. To be thrust into the national spotlight under those circumstances, then you become a target of the right wing online. You have the president's son liking a tweet accusing you of being in collaboration with the FBI. You were being called an actor. Looking back on all that, how do you think it affected your psychological development to be thrust into the national spotlight in those circumstances?
I mean, it wasn't great, obviously. But I think what I've come to realize over time is the reason why they spread so many of those conspiracy theories. One is it is because it came out that there were active disinformation campaigns that were being pushed by the Russian government and peddled by a lot of Republicans that were useful idiots in promoting those conspiracy theories about the shooting at my high school not happening. There's a lot of people who say that I wasn't at my school during the shooting because of intentionally, manipulatively edited things saying that I went back to my school after the shooting, when what's true is that I was at school that day. I went home after the shooting, obviously, but then I came back to my school because there were all these journalists there, and I couldn't stand to be home and just sit around and do nothing. I felt like somebody had to say something, and that's how I showed up there to do my first interview on Laura Ingram's show. But what they take out of that context of when I say that is they'll cut it out and say, oh yeah, I rode my bike back to school because I couldn't take my car because I didn't have my car because it was at school. It was literally part of an active crime scene. And they'll edit that to make it sound like I wasn't even at school that day, even though I literally was interviewing my classmates during the shooting. What I realized in terms of why they were promoting that, it's because I was right in that you cannot say you're politicizing tragedy to a group of kids that went through this shooting, saying that they're politicizing their own tragedy where their friends died. So what do you do if you're in the position of the NRA? You can't argue with those kids. So what you have to do is create such a massive smear campaign that smear campaign, that disinformation and those lies become the story instead of what those kids are saying, because they knew what we were saying was too powerful and it was too effective because it was compelling, because we weren't owned by anybody. We weren't, part of any special interest. We weren't saying go out there and vote for Democrats or go out there and vote for Republicans or anybody like that. We were saying, screw all of you. You suck. You've all failed us, because they have, and shame them into acting. And they didn't know how to handle that because they couldn't just write us off necessarily. And, it definitely took a toll, for sure. All the death threats that I got, that my family got, that my mom still is very traumatized from the aftermath of the shooting, of the death threats and everything. And she, still will get calls even years later of people saying that they're going to kill her, and they will not stop calling her and say that they know where she lives and all this other crazy stuff. So it has taken a big toll on my family.
Was there ever a point during all of it that you had second guesses about becoming this public person? I mean, you were kind of like thrown into the spotlight. So much happened. Was there ever a point where you're like, I don't know, maybe I just want to go do something else with my life and not be such a target at such a young age?
No, because my classmates had already lost what mattered most to us at that point. And I was so enraged. I was so enraged and am still so furious about what happened that I've never gone back and thought to myself, maybe I shouldn't say this, or I shouldn't be out there doing this in the first place. Because if everybody thinks that, then nobody else will. And I have even more of a responsibility being in this role now to show like how if I can go through this and I can deal with all the death threats and the harassment and everything, then certainly other people can stand up with us too, because we're a movement. It's not just me. It's so many people around the country, and that's why I've never gone back and second guessed it at all. I knew what I was doing was right and that I believed in it.